Before the start of the discussion, I'd like to say a few words of brief introduction. So today's event is related to the latest course released by PenTest entitled Aerospace Cybersecurity Satellite Hacking, designed and instructed by Angelina Tsuboi, who is here with us today. Hello, Angelina. How are you?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Bartek, for having me on today for this webinar, and thank you so much to Tim for being willing to help host this and ask a few questions. I'm very excited to be talking about the course. I believe that space security is going to be imperative as we have more developments in the sector within the next few years. We're expecting a lot of developments to be made into the space, and thinking about cyber systems before they start becoming exploited is essential for safeguarding these systems as infrastructure expands. So I'm very excited to be talking a little bit more about the satellite hacking course today.
It's great to have you here, Angelina. And also we have the discussion host, Timothy Hoffman. Welcome.
Thank you
great
very
to have
much.
you here.
Thank you.
Timothy Hoffman is a cybersecurity executive and consultant with a lifetime of cybersecurity work, including security design and engineering in satellite and missile systems. He spent 22 years in the US Navy and held responsibilities as the Director of Threat for the National Security Agency.
Bartek, thank you very much. Angelina and everyone, hello. Angelina, I'd like very much to delve into the idea that this subject is very beneficial, but could you describe the target audience and who would benefit most?
Right. So this course teaches you everything from the foundations up. So I made sure it was very beginner friendly, especially towards the beginning, where we cover most of Module 1 and the first half of Module 2 is specifically focused on covering the conceptual knowledge you need to understand in order to begin satellite pen testing and analyzing satellite onboard systems and subsystems that might be vulnerable. So I designed it with the beginners in mind. Module 3 and 4 might be a little bit tougher for beginners, but it could serve as a way to provide knowledge for people who are a little bit more experienced with pen testing and really want to apply their skill set into the aerospace sector. But I made sure that everything was cumulative and all the knowledge you would need in order to conduct pen testing would be covered. So just we cover orbital elements in the first section, cover all the subsystems that might be vulnerable, radio frequencies, frequency bands are also covered. So I made sure that everything is procedural, and if you go over the modules in sequence, that it should, in the end, it will give you a very good foundation to be conducting thorough audits and refined penetration tests on vulnerable systems.
Well, what really inspired you to create a course about penetration testing and satellites?
Yeah, so when I was first interested in aerospace cybersecurity, I didn't see a lot of resources out there on the internet in order to learn more about the things I was interested in. And it was just a need to have more educational resources and elucidate some of the concepts around aerospace and cybersecurity, because there would be courses specifically on like satellite systems and covering the conceptual aspects of like different subsystems within satellites. And there was also courses specifically for like penetration testing, but there wasn't really a course that combined the two in a very beginner friendly and cohesive way. So I really wanted to provide an avenue for people who were interested in getting into aerospace cybersecurity and satellite cybersecurity in order to learn about it in a beginner friendly manner.
designing satellites 15 years ago, we had nothing like this. And if we had something like this, it would have put us way ahead in the security realm. Can you tell us again, just a thumbnail, about what the prerequisites are that people should have, and what the main objective of the course really is? What is pen testing to you, and what is the main objective of the course?
Right. So I think that's a very important question, because the main objective of this course is not to make things drop out of the sky. Like, it's quite the opposite. I really want to make sure the mission of this course was to elucidate some of the vulnerabilities behind satellites so we can better safeguard it and protect them. It's not so that we can hack into these systems and cause collisions. It's so we can have a better threat model in mind and intuitively based within our skill set. So whenever we do develop systems, or whenever you do apply these skills within the workforce, that you already have that knowledge in the background, so you're not making systems that may be vulnerable to these very common and easy to execute attacks. So some of the basic prerequisites you should know. So in the first module, we do cover a little bit of satellite open source intelligence and reconnaissance techniques, and we do expect you to have some basic understanding of Python, which was listed in the PenTest course requirements, but it should only be about a week's level of experience. If you know how to make functions and variables in Python, then reading and utilizing pre-built open source programs that we utilize to conduct audits and research on satellite subsystems in the first module should be a breeze. Also, having a little bit of aerospace background can be helpful. We do cover a lot about orbits, and especially within the first part of module 1, and a little bit of module 2, we do go really deep into orbital mechanics and different telemetry vectors that satellites can have, which is also helpful for modules 3 and 4, where we actually apply those techniques to run penetration tests on satellites. So having a little bit of aerospace background and a little bit of development background could be helpful, but it isn't necessary, in my opinion.
So if I'm getting it, you're going to talk about orbits, you're going to talk about frequency bands, modulation techniques,
Yes.
things that keep a satellite in view. And a question came up in the chat about whether we're going to talk only about the course or whether we're going to get into it. We're going to get into it, folks. However, I want to make sure we understand what this course is and what the course is about. And for those who have any trepidation about jumping in, what I'm hearing, Angelina, is that the prerequisites or the recommended prior knowledge is not as steep as maybe someone who has done penetration testing for many years. Actually, someone could take a course at a college, or they could take and use their existing knowledge if they've been working in the field. Is that accurate?
Yes. Yeah. I made sure to structure the course in a way where it's very simple and straightforward in the beginning before we go deep into the details. So yes, if you're new to this, this course still would be very applicable and useful for you.
So radio frequency, signal propagation, spectrum analysis, specific tools. Can we talk about the tools and technologies that will be used during the training, but that are things that penetration testers typically don't use?
Yeah, I would say, since it would be illegal for me to demonstrate real life attack scenarios on camera, I did find other ways around simulating attacks within a confined environment where there's no any inherent risks or consequences.
Okay.
So we do use some kind of we do use a lot of Python programs and run a lot of simulations using technologies.
Do you put those into screenshots in the course so that people can see exactly what you've done?
Yes. So each module contains a thorough tutorial. So whenever I am demonstrating these attacks, you can follow along with me. I do go over each of the tools I'm using, what development machine I'm using. Everything is done and step by step.
Okay. Can you talk about software-defined radios and the need for understanding the radio aspects?
Yes, definitely. So I dedicated an entire module to going over satellite communication schemes and also tools such as radio frequency analyzers and transmitters and software-defined radios in order to listen to satellites, because a lot of intrinsic vulnerabilities to satellites is the communication link and how they're communicating with the ground station. And if communication were to be intercepted via eavesdrop scenario or jammed or spoofed, there's a lot of consequences that could manifest as a result of that. So I dedicate the first half of, I think, module 2 in order to cover all the radio frequency bands you need to know, modulation schemes, demodulation. We go into the details about what composes the transponder of a satellite and the functionalities of the antenna, like the transmitter and the receiver. So you have a deep conceptual knowledge of how that works. And then the second part of that module is dedicated to tools you could get access to, such as like the HackRF, which is pretty cheap, and also other antennas and software-defined radio equipment you could use to listen in on satellites.
So this is not prohibitive in terms of expense. It's a fairly easy getting in, getting out, low cost, plus the cost of the course, of course. Do you talk about satellite-specific software and satellite-specific firmware in the course? Does the student get a chance to understand what they're actually getting into as opposed to just brushing over that, or do you dive deep into that?
Yes. So part of what we do cover a little bit in the course is the onboard computer system and different command and control links. And we go over reverse engineering and decoding packets and analyzing vulnerabilities within satellite-based firmware. So I would say that is a huge part of the course. And I think I have about 2 interactive labs demonstrating how we could dissect firmware and reverse engineer packets, communication packets that are being transmitted to and from the satellite and the ground station.
Okay, we got a question in the chat about
Yes.
A person wants to know if they can leverage their .NET expertise. I would almost wonder, isn't it? You talked about Python, but isn't it true that someone who knows how to program really can learn other languages? It's just a matter of learning it.
100%.
Okay.
100%.
Yeah. That person that asked the question probably has a little bit of a leg up because they already know one programming language. It's easy to add on others, or easier. I shouldn't say it's easy, because learning to program, to everyone who programs, I'm not a programmer. I did it in 1980. Now, let's talk a little bit about satellite protocols, because satellite protocols, as I understand them, are different. Back in the day, when we were managing satellite frequencies, the protocols were very rudimentary and very easily hackable. I've heard protocols called CCSDS, HDLC, QPSK, BPSK. Can you generically talk a little bit about each of those, or talk a little bit
Yeah,
generically about all of them?
I can go over. So during Module 2, where we cover communication systems behind satellites, we go over different packet conventions and also like modulation techniques behind different radio frequencies. A huge part of satellite hacking consists of understanding the communication link. So we cover whenever data is transmitted, it typically follows a standardized format such as CCSDS.
Okay.
So
Okay. How much does the student have to bring? How much does the student have to bring to the course to really get up to their eyeballs in the protocols?
honestly, I cover it very in depth on a conceptual level. So I don't think you need to have any previous knowledge. Like it is very good to have some a conceptual understanding of how radio frequencies work and frequency bands, but honestly, I cover that from the ground up in the second module.
In the course, do you talk about penetration testing being the assessment of the security of the satellite software, the satellite firmware, all the different protocols, the telemetry, the communications, and all that?
Yes, so we first go into frequency bands, and then from there we walk you through different types of bands you can analyze under specific purposes, and how you can take a satellite, look over its manufacturer details, find which band it's located with, and then identify what kind of packet techniques it uses in order to be able to decode communication that's being sent from the satellite to another ground station.
Are there labs that include the radios, the SDR sharp, the new radio, the pieces of the puzzle that are needed to put together the connection?
Yes, so there are two labs that require some kind of either radio software or hardware. I go over one example of a GNSS spoofing attack with the HackRF. And then we also do analyze satellite communications using new radio and SDR sharp.
Does the student have to have their own Earth radio station, meaning a dish, a modem, a ground station? Do they have to build all that?
Yeah, I think this course would be a lot more expensive if I included that. I did think about it in the beginning, but I do cover how you could set up a station like that within the fourth module. However, because I wanted to keep the financial barrier to entry of this course a little bit lower in order to make it more accessible to beginners or people who are just interested in getting into the field, I made sure to keep materials you would need relatively cheap. And if you do not have access to the materials or don't have funding to get those materials, you can still keep it for later usage and still learn about how you can apply what you know to conduct some kind of PenTest scenario.
Okay. Another question in chat was: is there going to be a recording of this session done? And the answer to that, of course, is yes. And Bartek has already answered the question in the chat. There will be a link sent to all the participants, so there's no barrier to getting this information back. Another question that came up in the chat: is it possible to find bugs in satellites after this course? Angelina, I'm going to throw that at you.
Yeah. I think I'm assuming you mean like bugs within the firmware or some kind of like tweak within the communication link you could exploit to send malicious commands up to a satellite. We do cover both of those things in this course. So yes, I would say it would be using what you learn from this course, you can find bugs within satellites.
Well, now it would seem to me that getting into satellites is beyond most beginners. And it would also seem that it would require some advanced knowledge of cybersecurity fundamentals. what do you recommend to folks to talk about cybersecurity fundamentals so they understand that they're jumping into the deep end of the pool?
Right. So I think what I do in this course in order to make sure I'm also covering cybersecurity fundamentals, because I did acknowledge that there might be some people who have like no cybersecurity experience, who are just really experienced within the aerospace sector who want to take this course. So in order to make this course accessible to them, I made sure that cybersecurity concepts are also intertwined with aerospace concepts. So we cover things such as attack surfaces, attack vectors. Like, I define what that means and how that could help you conduct like a penetration test on the satellite, go over open source intelligence. I define what it is, and then we run a few labs on it. So I think there's a great coalition between two fields that could help optimize learning wherever you fit on the spectrum from aerospace to cybersecurity.
Could you talk a little bit about how much networking or network security should be part of the person's background before they start into something like this?
Yeah, we do cover a little bit of networks, a little bit about like network segments and intrinsic vulnerabilities within when we cover ground stations, and also the communication link segment. I would say if you really want to get into like the nitty gritty about discovering satellite networking vulnerabilities, at least a year of experience, or but it really does depend on where your focus is at this course. Like you mentioned to me before, satellites are very, very complex. There's a lot of moving parts. There's lots of technologies being employed. So I think it depends on where you're trying to specialize in. But if you're truly just like networking specific and want to get into that portion of the field, then I would say like you should have some background in the course. I can
Okay.
much of that. Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about tools, techniques, procedures, etc. Let's talk about things like Metasploit, Wireshark, Nmap, the old stuff that's been out there a while. How much knowledge would you say would be standard to get into this course for someone to bring with them? How much should they know about the tools?
Yeah, so whenever I do use a tool within a lab, I make sure to cover it briefly before diving right in. However, I think you could lose out on some of the nuances of tools and sometimes like not be able to catch up on everything if you don't have prior exposure to it beforehand. I make sure to link resources before each lab where I do use a tool. I link at least a few resources that people can either watch over or read through in order to get a better understanding of it.
Okay.
But
Are those
again,
tools adaptable? I'm sorry.
Pardon?
Are those tools adaptable to satellite penetration testing?
Yes, I would say so. Like I mentioned before, exploiting satellite systems is highly integrated, and you could definitely transfer some of your cybersecurity knowledge, especially if you are experienced with radio frequency hacking. I would say a lot of that is applicable to hacking satellites as well.
Okay. A question came up in the chat if there was an intention to develop a follow-up course. Bartek has already answered that and said yes. That there will be more courses, obviously, at deeper levels. The next question I have, though, should I have to understand a whole array of tools when we say complex? Part of what my question is are the old tools adaptable? You said yes. The what other tools does the course cover that might be helpful for me to go and look at? What tools do you use besides the Metasploit? I mean, I'm familiar with Kali. I'm familiar with Kali Purple, by the way. That's an interesting subset of tools. But what about satellite hacking? What other tools do we really need to consider?
Yeah. Oh boy, we cover a lot of tools in this course. I would
Oh,
say, yeah, it's very integrated. So we cover like a full array of cybersecurity tools, and also a lot of simulators. We also cover um, um, visualizers. We use Python programs. So
wow. Okay.
I,
Okay. I get it. I get it. We're going to go off script. We're going to go off script pretty fast. A question that came up in the chat also, is there a certain math requirement? Um, I have a degree in math. The question to you is, how much math do you really need in the world of penetration testing and this specific course? Do I need to bring my master's degree?
um, well, there are specific mathematical aspects you should understand, but I believe a lot of it is self-teachable if you have a solid, like at least to um, a high school degree equivalent of mathematical background. You should be fine. You can teach yourself the rest of it. We do cover orbital mechanics, and that does involve a little bit of math. However, you could also
Please say that again. We
yeah,
cover.
orbital mechanics, which requires a little bit of math. And also when we do exploit like a little bit of telemetry data or get like GPS signals, or um, whenever you're working with radio frequencies, there's always going to be numbers that pop up. There's always ways to make it easier. There's tons of tools out there that are open source. Lots of open source like online based calculators you can use. So I wouldn't say if you don't have that much experience in math, it shouldn't be a hindrance to your ability to take this course.
Okay, so it's not math intensive. What I'm
No.
hearing is, what you're saying is that the software that you're showing in the course helps the student with the math to some degree.
Yes, definitely.
I'm going to take the question out of the chat. How big of a role does open source intelligence actually play in satellite security?
Oh, I would say a huge role. Yeah, so I dedicated, I think, the first module to satellite reconnaissance and open source intelligence, because the thing about satellites is that a lot of the subsystems that make them up can be very different, even if like it's the same type of satellite. Like two CubeSats can be completely different based off of the subsystems and components that they are comprised of. So I go over lots of resources, databases you should look into in order to understand the underlying technologies that are running the satellite, communication links it connects to. We analyze like a ton of different data sheets going over the uh, the technical specifications of like antenna systems, communication systems, um, and really understanding what components make up a satellite, so we know what vulnerabilities it might have.
So if I was a person listening to this talk, I think what I would want out of it are some real world examples. Could you give a real world example or two about what a case study maybe that you've done of satellite penetration testing?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah. It's interesting because it's attacks against satellites have dated back to, I think, at least the 70s, where there was a U.S. and German joint collaboration to create a satellite that garnered a lot of scientific data using X-ray. It was called the ROSAT, and what happened with that satellite was a team of hackers were able to exploit into the data centers in the Goddard NASA center, and they were able to get access to the solar panel control system of the satellite. And as we know in space, that space is a really, really harsh environment. So if you rotate any or move some kind of component in such a configuration, it could ruin and compromise the entire system. So what they did was they rotated the satellites to face towards the sun. That burnt out the battery and rendered the satellite useless. And about a decade later, it came crashing back down to Earth. Now, since low Earth orbit is a lot more populated with lots of like internet service providers and a lot more startup companies deploying their satellite systems, a compromisation scenario like that could lead to massive collisions and a lot of possibly fatalities if they come crashing back down and escape over.
Okay, so basically that's a real world example of some satellite hacking. I'm looking for another example, perhaps, of a penetration test where the manufacturer of the satellite or the company that sponsored the build of the satellite would authorize a penetration test, even while the satellite is on the ground, maybe, so that we could secure it before it goes up.
Right. Yeah. I think in general, a lot of companies now are trying to have a lot more pen testers test their systems as a form of like risk analysis before they deploy it. So there has been initiatives in that regard. I would say one investigation scenario I've looked into is with satellite encryption protocols. So there's been over the years, satellite encryption has not been standardized. So a lot of startups back then, they would just deploy satellites without their own proprietary encryption system in place, and that made their communication links extremely vulnerable to interception or spoofing. Now there's been a more of a demand for better encryption schemes, and they're also developing like quantum satellites now, which is incredible in my opinion, in order to make sure that the communication link is secure. So I've heard a lot about different researchers conducting penetration tests on like communication links and the security of encryption protocols before satellites are deployed into orbit.
One of the questions in the chat that was brought up is, could you name some open source intelligence tools that might be used in satellite hacking? I'm not familiar with that spectrum. Maybe you have some suggestions.
I would say it's going to be hard to name them. Like, there's so many you could use. A little bit difficult for me to name them all off the top of my head, but you could use N2IO for satellite, like anything related to gathering satellite telemetry. I would use N2IO. There's a lot of tools I go over in Module 1 that relate to satellite based open source intelligence. There's like a lot of there's lots of tools out there. There's remote sensing satellite catalogs, which give you access to specific data and images from satellites and media assets. There's also satellite like component guideline websites where they show you a catalog of satellites and they give you the data sheet and that lists the specifications of the satellite, what components make it up, what company was built by. So there's a lot of modalities you can utilize to extract information from satellites.
I pulled up a real quick search, and it looks like there's quite a bit of open source intelligence that's actually provided right on YouTube in 20 and 10-minute clips. So that's going to answer that question. Another question that came up in chat is how much of an overlap in terms of approach and methodologies does the pen testing of satellites have to do with the traditional pen test activities? The question is really around web apps versus satellites. What would you use different tools? Obviously for the RF side of it, but what about
Yeah.
for the pen test side of it?
Ooh. It depends if I'm dealing with the satellite or if I'm dealing with the ground station. If I'm dealing with the ground station, or if it's some kind of consumer-based satellite system, then it would be different. It depends. Like if it's a government-affiliated satellite or just it's like a general consumer satellite. If it's a consumer satellite, I would probably analyze what services are being used in order to extract information from the satellite, and that could be conducive of a situation where you could use traditional web app penetration tools in order to um, extract information about some of the APIs are being called to access a satellite.
Yeah,
Um,
we're seeing a lot about APIs these days. A lot. So what you're saying is a lot of the same tools could be used.
yeah,
However, there are other tools. And I think that's the most important part of this is that the tools we already know we can use with penetration testing, that will transfer. And then there's additional knowledge to be learned in this course.
yes,
It's
exactly.
sounding like. One of the suggestions was to have a do-it-yourself radio station. I think along those lines, obviously, it would be a nice thing to have a radio station for people to use. Unfortunately, I think finding the government willing to allow people to hack their satellites is going to be a different
Yeah.
that could be considered information warfare. And I don't want to be on the bad guy side of that one. Can you talk a little bit about evolving satellite technologies that maybe the course might be able to address, or that a follow-on course could think about? It seems like satellites are very complex. They have modems and ground stations, telemetry and protocols, and yada yada. What do you see the future to look like? That's a big question.
Yeah, I think in the short term, I'm seeing a lot more demand for smaller satellite systems, so like pico satellites, nano satellites. I see a lot of more of those. The thing is, um, when people develop, so like anyone could deploy their own satellite as long as it's approved by NASA or some organization they're affiliated with that is willing to deploy their satellite, um, and they have the money to fund it, which is a little bit concerning to me because, well, there's people who are trying to build like CubeSats for $1,000, but what does $1,000 CubeSat entail? Like, it could be vulnerable to a wide range of cyber security vulnerabilities that a normal, like robust, like highly invested satellites don't have. So I see a lot of vulnerabilities related intrinsic to like pico and nano satellites and like smaller scale satellites. For more of a long-term concern, I would say development that I'm interested in would be the use of more modern communication links. So I think there was a Chinese company that recently deployed a quantum-based satellite where it was a satellite that was just communicating information using encrypted channels with quantum-based systems, which is like insane to me now that we're applying that like to pretty new technologies together in order to make a highly robust system. And how can we access threat scenarios based around those satellites? Who knows?
You're going there, and that's the next question that came out of the chat. What is or what are the most vulnerable flight segment systems when a satellite is in orbit, and how do we mitigate them?
Ooh. That's a very good question. When a satellite is in orbit,
Can I interject something for you, Angelina? Because one of the satellite systems that we worked on back 15 years ago, many years ago actually, had to do with the integrated monitoring and power control subsystem that managed to do a lot of power control and whatnot. And when we talk about vulnerabilities, we talk about anything that moves the satellite, anything that steers the satellite, anything that raises or lowers. Could be very dangerous because typically satellites are put in a very specific orbit at a very specific location
right.
around the Earth's surface. I think that technology has to evolve and get better. Back in the 70s, we managed the frequencies, we managed the channels. Later on, we had to manage even more micro slices, if you will, of bandwidths. And that's, I think, what's coming in the future is smaller and smaller segments to deal with. I think the technology as it advances is going to be very sophisticated. I think it has to be. And you pointed out satellites that come from companies that are government funded with many millions of dollars of encrypted channelization are going to act and defend a lot better than a nano satellite that's put up for $1,000 that has literally no capability of protecting itself. So you're 100% spot on. I think that's an area where we need to get companies smart. If they're going to put satellites up, they need to understand that the approvals are there, the rules are there for a reason, because otherwise it's already been referred to as a space junkyard by better minds than me. What do you see are some of the security threats that might come from generalized threats? I don't want to talk about specific threats, but is there a database now of specific satellite vulnerabilities and specific threats that people should pay attention to?
Yeah, so one resource I would point people to is the Sparta. I forgot what it stands for, but it was, I think I'm affiliated with the organization now to an extent, of researchers who are and professionals in the space and cyber industries in order to list a comprehensive analysis of threat vectors behind satellites and vulnerabilities in subsystems intrinsic to specific attacks that could be executed against satellites. So I would recommend you look into that resource. In general, there's so many vulnerabilities and there's different modalities you can pursue to exploit satellites. I would say jamming, spoofing is pretty common. Reverse engineering and decoding communications. Exploiting the command and control link. People are getting pretty creative nowadays with how they're exploiting satellite subsystems because there's so many. But if you want like a comprehensive list of attacks you could run on a satellite, I would check out the Sparta resource.
So the link that I pulled up is at aerospace.org, and it's the Space Attack Research and Tactic Analysis.
Yeah,
matrix.
exactly.
The
Yeah.
Sparta matrix serves to ensure space cyber community is empowered to continually educate engineers and system defenders so they can overcome the unique cyber threats they face in the domain. Um, I know that there's a lady at the Cybersecurity Center who is invested in the Space ISAC, which is an information analysis and sharing opportunity. One other item that came up that was asked in the chat. Would you please elaborate a bit more on the legal aspects of satellite pen testing? And I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not qualified to answer that. I don't know that we can really elaborate too much, but uh, some folks would consider it an act of war if you, for example, if you went after a Chinese satellite, or you went after a United States or a French or a United Kingdom satellite that was heavily protected by the government. I think the legal aspects are going to be difficult to outline. What do you think, Angelina?
Yeah, I'm not too experienced with the legal side of things, since I tend to focus on the technical pen testing side. But I would say if you're be careful if you're running any active attacks, like passive stuff, like basic reconnaissance and trying to like pinpoint vulnerabilities. That's fine, and doing research on that is completely fine. But when you're starting to like actually transmit any signals or deploying payloads, that's when you want at least want to have some kind of simulated environment where you conduct that in, where it's safe, and you know there's not going to be any legal repercussions to what you're doing.
So this is the whole idea of having a course to get you started into this. Okay, another question from the folks online. Do you know of any bug bounty programs for hacking satellites?
Oh, that's a very good question. I know NASA has a few bug bounties here and there, but I'm not sure if it's specific for their satellites. I need to look into that because I haven't heard of any bug bounty programs for satellites. I've heard of defense companies and like governmental organizations that are space based releasing bug bounties, but not specifically for their satellite infrastructure.
One of the folks on the chat said you can submit tickets to SpaceX, hack their Starlink for practice. I don't know if I'd hack a satellite for practice, but I certainly would take the course. That sounds like a good idea. Anyway, could you describe from the course? Could you describe just a couple of examples of the hands-on labs so that people understand you're in an environment, a contained environment where you're going to do hands-on labs and show them how to hack a satellite?
Yeah, definitely. So in the first module, we cover just basic satellite mapping. So we go over using open source intelligence tools in order to calculate passes and determine frequency bands, and we visualize a satellite in orbit using online tools. And throughout the entire module, like I'm walking you through different websites you can use and different resources, so you're always actively applying your open OSINT skills to audit for different satellite vulnerabilities within specific satellites. And the second module and third module, where we go over communication links, we go over sites you can use to find frequencies. We look over different transmission systems for specific satellites to figure out what antenna they're using and what frequency band it's going to be transmitting on, and then tuning into those frequency bands, like how you would tune into it using if you were to have access to an RTL SDR, and how you would decode it using new radio. We also go over jamming and spoofing attacks, but that's within a completely containerized environment. All the passive stuff I can show you how to do, but whenever it gets active, that's when we use a simulated environment. So, for example, when we go over spoofing and jamming, we're using an open source program that's specific for simulating spoofing scenarios to do so. So I would say those are examples of what we do.
Thank you, Angelina. I wanted to say thank you very much for this hour that we spent together. I'd like to cap it here and let folks ask questions in chat if they have other questions, so that we can wrap this up and say thanks to everyone who attended. Say thanks to PenTest Magazine for their hosting of this and giving us the platform to talk about this. There's a lot of design and development that's going on in the satellite arena, and a lot of folks want to put satellites up.
I'd also like to thank you, Angelina, and you, Timothy, for a great talk. It was very interesting to hear. And thank you all who participated, who has been here with us today. This was a great, inspiring talk, and I would even say it was cosmically inspiring to me.
Thank you,
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Appreciate it.